If you're following along with this 4-part series, you know that we have a judgment and it's time to enforce it. But if you don't know how to do that, you better watch this video. Welcome back to our 4-part series on how to evict a tenant in the state of Pennsylvania. If you do not watch these 2 videos before this one, please do. This is a nitty-gritty description of our eviction process, and we try to share it so you can learn as much as possible. Now, as a reminder, this is not legal advice, and it's not intended to be legal advice. This is simply our company sharing with you how we manage this difficult process for our clients every day. I'm going to continue in these series as if you have a judgment on the property from your hearing, which we talked about in the second video. So you have a judgment. The judge says the tenant has to do what you've asked. Now there's 2 different kinds of judgments the judge can order. One would be one for possession and one would be for pay and stay. So the first one that we're going to talk about is pay and stay. And that's the most typical kind of judgment a judge will offer. So that would mean that the judge says, yes, tenant, you owe X amount of dollars to the landlord, and I've issued a judgment for that. But in Pennsylvania, this is what's called a pay and stay state. Essentially, at any point up until when the constable actually evicts them, the tenant can pay the money and the process stops. So most judgments are issued with those kinds of terms. Although you can request and judges can order a possession judgment, meaning that the judge says, hey, tenant, you need to pay this money and you're still going to be evicted. So we're getting a money judgment and the property back. Now, what kind of judgment you ask for is really up to you, and the judge will use their own discretion in how to ask for that. But our criteria for asking for a possession judgment has to do with the type of non-compliance we're dealing with. If it's dangerous to the property, dangerous to other residents or to our staff, if it's hostile and violent, well, then we're going to ask for possession. There's not really a lot of reasons we'd want to keep that person in the house. But if it's just a money judgment, just a non-payment issue, we're really happy to do pay and stay judgments, and we don't typically ask for possession unless it becomes a repeated problem. Now you need to make that decision for you, and judges each make their own decision on how to issue those judgments. But just so you know that there's 2 different kinds of judgments that a judge could order. And the pay and stay is really quite literal. And I've had this exact situation happen where I went through the whole process. It was time for the eviction. The constable and I went to the door, knocked on the door. And when the door opened, a hand with a wad full of cash was stuck out. I took the cash, I counted it, and it was to the dollar what was owed on that judgment, including court costs. So the constable and I walked away from the door. It was over. We were able to report to the court that the judgment had been satisfied. And so that's what I mean by pay and stay. At any point, if the tenant makes whole on the judgment and the court fees that the judge says they need to pay, they can stop the eviction as long as you haven't been issued a possession judgment. No matter what judgment you were ordered, and if you are unsure, ask the judge in the courtroom. Do not leave that courtroom until you understand your judgment. But no matter what kind of judgment you were ordered, if 10 days passes after the hearing, that is the appeal period. That is the opportunity for either party to contest the judgment that the district magistrate ordered at the county court. So the process for that is to go to the prothonotari's office and file for an appeal. Now there's some paperwork that needs to be done, and if you're a tenant who's been had a judgment against you for non-payment, the tenant does need to pay some money to the court in order to apply for this and in order to kind of hold up the eviction. So it's not a get out of jail free card. It's not really actually a great way to postpone the eviction. I think more landlords are scared of this than they should be. But during that 10 days after the judgment, after the hearing, we're really waiting to see if an appeal is filed. If an appeal is filed, and I have done hundreds of evictions, I've had 3 appeals in my entire career. You know, they're not fun, but they're not super common. When you find yourself in the case of having an appeal filed, I call my attorney first thing. I don't handle one thing from that point on. The process is actually quite different, much more intensive, and it does require the skill of an attorney to take care of for you, in my opinion. If you do manage to go that whole 10-day appeal period without having an appeal filed, and the tenant hasn't made right on the judgment, so they haven't paid the judgment or taken care of the non-compliance issue, then you're at the point in the process where you're going to file the order of possession. The order of possession is a document that you file at the district magistrate that asks the judge to enforce their judgment. So what you'll do is you'll go back to that district court, the same one you filed the landlord-tenant complaint in, the same one you had your hearing in, and you would take your judgment. So that's a piece of paper they've mailed to you after your hearing. You take it with you along with a check, and you're going to tell the clerk, I'd like to file an order of possession. They'll take that document from you so they can get the docket number and names. They'll look it up and they'll actually produce the filing. You won't have to fill out a piece of paper in order to file the order of possession. They'll present it to you, you'll review it and sign it. And at that point, they'll tell you what the filing fee is. You can expect another $150 to $200. This is chargeable to the tenant. They should be paying you back for that. That is then added to their balance. So once you file this, that paperwork will then go to the judge, who would sign off on it and then send it to a constable who will schedule an eviction approximately 10 days, no, less than 10 days, but around 10 or 11 days after you're filing for the order of possession. This is a document that would be sent to you and posted on the tenant's door, detailing the date and time the eviction is set to take place. So what happens at the eviction? Well, simply put, the constable is going to make sure that all the people have been removed from the property and allow you the opportunity to change the locks and take possession of the property back. So here's how that really looks. We might be given an eviction time of 9 a.m. on a Monday. So we will send a property manager, property management staff, and a maintenance technician to the property to meet the constable with the keys to the property. They're going to give the keys to the constable. The constable will then clear the property. So they'll make sure that there's no one in the property, that there's nothing going on in there, and that you're able to then change the locks. So once the constable has cleared the property, the tech gets started changing the locks, and then typically the constable will have a document of some kind saying that the property has been evicted, returned to the landlord, and that any attempt to gain entry or get into the property is criminal trespassing. And this is important because you don't want that tenant coming and going from the property as if they still have possession of it. But that could be a concern because they usually do leave some belongings. So I'll ask the constable, or I'll take them from the constable and post them on all the entry points to the house, all the doors. So now that you've changed the locks, the constable has cleared the property of any people. Now you're left with probably a pretty dirty apartment or house and a lot of belongings and trash left behind. So what do we do at that point? Well, our team starts to treat this like a normal move out. So on our normal move out inspections, we do a video move out inspection. And this is especially important in the case of an eviction because we have some extra steps to deal with all those likely abandoned belongings. So we want to document as close as possible to that eviction time at that same visit if possible, the condition of the apartment, and we use video. So a nice long video showing exactly what the property looked like at the time of eviction, what belongings were there, what state were they in. Now we're intending to look at the condition of the property in order to document it, but we also are able to capture what all they left and in what condition. So we have some documentation knowing what the place was like, and if there's any claims of anything, we can compare it against that video. It's really typical that there's stuff left behind, sometimes a lot of stuff. And there's a really defined process for how to handle this stuff in the state of Pennsylvania. And it starts with a notice. Let's take a look at the notice that you have to give the tenant when they're evicted. When you evict a tenant, you must provide notice to your tenant at the time of eviction, letting them know how to get any belongings. Here's a sample of the letter we give to tenants at the property if they are there at the time of eviction. If they're not, we tape it to the door of the property. We mail it to the last known address of the tenant, which is typically the one we just evicted them from, and care of any emergency contacts we have on file. All of those forms of contact are detailed in the process laid out in the state of Pennsylvania. Landlords must keep the belongings in the property and store them for the tenant for 10 days. If they say that they're going to come and get them, you need to arrange access for them to get the belongings. If they indicate they will get the stuff before 10 days after the eviction, then you must store it until they retrieve it or 30 days from the date of the eviction passes, whichever is sooner. After the 11th day, you can take the belongings out of the property and move it to an indoor proximate place for storage until the 30th day. You can also leave it in the property if you choose. The landlord is able to charge the tenant for storage fees from the 11th day through when they remove their belongings on or the 30th day, whichever is later. If you are left with belongings, you can throw them away and charge the cost of disposal to the tenant's damages. Do not forget, you still only have 30 days from the date you receive possession of the property, in this case, the eviction date. So you have 30 days from the eviction date to let this tenant know what happened with their security deposit. Now, it is very likely that this tenant has a balance on their account that this security deposit is going to settle. But in our Landlord-Tenant Act, we have 30 days to return the security deposit or any explanation of funds withheld to the tenant. Now, they also have to provide you a forwarding address, and that is not typically done in the case of an eviction. But what we do here at One Focus is we still send it out in the required amount of time. And if they didn't provide a forwarding address, I mail it to the last known address, which is typically the address I just evicted them from. So I send those out. Here's the problem. If this follows the case like most evictions, where you do the eviction and then through the next 30 days, you're actually engaging with the tenant to get them to remove all of their belongings, by the time the 30th day comes, you likely have not gotten an opportunity to do the turnover work in that apartment to make it ready for the next tenant. So you haven't been able to do any kind of painting or cleaning or flooring replacement, whatever you need to do, you haven't been able to do it. So if there's charges to the tenant, they're not going to be defined. So what we do is we, within those 30 days, will send out an estimated security deposit statement. And that would let them know, hey, we're going to have to withhold for cleaning, for trash removal, for touch-up paint, and it's estimated to be at this cost. And that's why we're withholding the security deposit or this portion of the security deposit. Now, once those bills are in and we have those final costs received, we do adjust that. So we'll adjust it to reflect the actual costs and send out a revised statement to the tenant. But it's really in your best interest not to ignore that 30-day deadline. There's some serious consequences for missing it, and I'd hate to see you end up with more damages and loss coming out of this bad situation than you have to. Here are a couple of things that I think you need to know about this process as we bring this series to a close. The first is you cannot withhold access to or take the tenant's belongings at any point in exchange for payment or their actions. These are not your belongings. You don't lay claim to them, and that is not the way to handle this. Treat their belongings with respect. They do belong to them, and you are not entitled to them until they are abandoned, which would be after the time has passed post-eviction where they had the opportunity to get their belongings. The second thing I wanted to let you know, don't damage or destroy the tenant's belongings, either before the eviction or after. So I've heard landlords talk about, well, I have to store the belongings, but nobody says how I have to store them. And they talk about putting them under a tent in outdoor settings. This is not okay. You are not permitted to do that sort of thing. You have to be respectful of the tenant's belongings. The third thing I want you to know is that your outcomes in this process, the thing that affects them the most is your professionalism. So how professional you are through this situation will guide how bad the damage is. And I hate to kind of put the onus on the landlord, but I think that's something that most landlords need to remember is that when they're in this situation, there's a lot of emotions, there's a lot of conflict, and it's really important that they slow down and treat it professionally because their behavior will increase the complication and severity of any kind of consequences. The fourth thing to know, you are going to be left with a lot of trash in this property. You just are. A lot. And it's going to be disgusting and dirty, and you're not going to want to deal with it. But you will not die. So know that going in, have a level of expectation about what you're going to be getting back from the property, and just make yourself at peace with it. And the fifth thing I know you want to know, you want to know if there's anything of value in that property, how are you going to turn that into payment against your debt? Well, I'm going to cover that in the fourth video of the series where I answer all of your wild and wacky questions, the things that you really want to know about. In the next video, I hope you'll like and subscribe to this video. I love making them for you every week. It's my hope to make real estate investors and landlords much more successful in their work. So until next time.